Good evening, everyone. Welcome to TrAIN Open Live event, which is the principal public program for the Research Center for Transnational Art, Identity and Nation, otherwise known as TrAIN. My name is Paul Goodwin, and I'm director of TrAIN, and it's a real pleasure and honor tonight to welcome artist, curator, writer, and researcher Shaheen Merali with us to present his lecture on the critical decade, political black art or not. I will, of course, introduce Shaheen in just a second. But first, I wanted to say a few words about TrAIN, especially for those of you who may be joining the TrAIN Open live event series for the first time. So TrAIN is a community of researchers based at University of the Arts London, or UAL, that in our work, we try to challenge dominant top-down notions of globalization, and we attempt to create new visions of a more plural and worlded art and design history and theory. We are made up of curators, art and design historians, artists, practice-based researchers and theorists from across many disciplines at UAL, and we have a thriving community of research students and associate researchers. If you want to find out more about us and what we do, including future events in the TrAIN Open live event series, please have a look at our website, which is on the main UAL website under research centers, or if you search for TrAIN under the UAL website, you'll be able to find it, and we'll put the link as we continue in the meeting. Before we start, can I also just reiterate to make sure that everyone, as you join, switches off their cameras and mutes their mic so we can all hear Shaheen properly. Thank you. Can you mute your camera and your mic, please? Thank you very much. So Shaheen will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A, a question and answer session, where you can use the hand raising button on Zoom to indicate that you want to ask a question. And then after I say, you can ask, I'll be moderating the questions, and then you can turn on your mic and your camera to ask your question. And tonight we're having an open Zoom meeting deliberately, rather than the webinar mode that we normally use and that many people use, precisely because in discussion with Shaheen, Shaheen really was really interested in having a more open discussion and seeing friendly faces and having a more interactive event, right? So this is not a webinar mode. This is, but that's why we also need you to make sure that during the first part of the meeting, you please keep your cameras off and your mics muted. So now let me just introduce tonight's speaker. Shaheen Merali is a curator, critic, and artist born in Tanzania of Indian heritage, but lives in Britain. Shaheen began his artistic practice in the 1980s, committing to social, political, and personal narratives. As his practice evolved, he focused more on his work as a curator and has now moved into the sphere of research and writing. He's currently a PhD candidate at Coventry University, based at the Center for Arts, Memory and Communities Research Institute for Creative Cultures with Carolina Ritu. His research is concerned with contemporary political Black arts practices that emerged in the Asian African diaspora in the early 1980s, and their relationship to the curatorial and self-organizational formations in British arts. Shaheen was the curator, of course, for the inaugural Uganda Pavilion, Radiance, They Dream in Time, for the International Art Exhibition of the 59th Venice Biennale. At the Golden Lion ceremony, which of course was won by TrAIN's Sonia Boyce, TrAIN member Sonia Boyce, the pavilion, the Ugandan pavilion that Shaheen curated, was presented with a special mention award, which is a fantastic achievement in anyone's book. He was the co-curator of Berlin Heist, or the Enduring Fascination of Walled Cities, for the 4th Mediations Biennale in Poznan, Poland in 2014, and also co-curator of the 6th Gwangju Biennale in Korea in 2006. Currently, Shaheen is the curatorial consultant on the Provisional Semantics case study, addressing the challenges of representing multiple perspectives within an evolving digitized national collection. Shaheen has led a series of 3 discussions based on the collection, researching the Panchayat Special Collection, which is donated of course, brilliantly to the Tate Britain Library in 2015. This will be published in late spring 2023. He's a member of the steering group of the role of visual arts organisations in Black British arts movement in the Midlands, the AHRC networking project, which is led by Carolina Rito and co-led by myself. And Shaheen was also the head of the Department of Education, Film and New Media at the Haus der Kulturelle der Welt, the House of World Cultures in Berlin. That was between 2003 to 2008. And there he curated several exhibitions and important publications, including The Black Atlantic, of course, Dreams and Trauma, Moving Images in the Promised Lands, and Reimagining Asia, 1,000 Years of Separation. He has taught at UAL, at Central St. Martin's School of Art, before it was called UAL, between 1995 and 2003. And he's also been a lecturer and researcher at the University of Westminster between 1997 and 2003. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Shaheen to come to the stage and present his talk on Critical Decade, Political Black Art or Not. Thank you, Shaheen.
Thank you very much, Paul. Can we go back? Yeah. Can everybody see me? Can you hear me?
Can hear you, Shaheen.
All right, fantastic. All right, it's lovely to be here with you all. It's, to be honest, I've not done a presentation on Zoom for a very long time. One of the last times I was here on an online portal presenting was probably during lockdown. And one such memorable talk was organized by Paul Goodwin for the British Art Network Annual Conference in 2021. So I must begin by thanking Paul and the assistance offered by Evelina Warner in providing a second opportunity to contribute through the TrAIN open lecture. Paul has offered a space for about 40 to 45 minutes with images followed by a Q&A session as he outlined. And I would like to start by also acknowledging my thanks to Pamela Merali and to Narendra Pachkede for reading the text and providing clarifications for the arguments I'm about to make. So let's begin. Any offer of an open lecture begins with a title, a meaningful way to introduce what these 45 minutes might try to untangle. So I begin with the title, The Critical Decade, Political Art or Not. The title refers, of course, offers a critical point of entry into the historiography of the period that I'm concerned with, 1979 to 1992. These years represent two bookends. And can I have the first slide? The first part of the bookend, 1979, represents the beginning of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's premiership, which ended in 1990. And the additional 2 years ending in 1992 is the time it took to understand or fathom the abysmal reality of Britain. The two bookends are also the dates, and can I have the next slide, please? The two bookends are also the dates of 13 distinct publications, which are the TrAIN publications that came out from Birmingham. TrAIN sounds or was made up to sound like tenant, T-E-N-E-T, which is the notion of a principle or belief, especially one of the main principles of a religion or philosophy. And it is that I want to engage with in today's talk. How did we engage with certain principles in this period is what I want to flesh out as an argument. The premise of the talk is embedded in British art history and is fully framed by its ability to undermine, underrate, and be underscored by any means possible. So what I want to try and get at is, what I mean by that is how class, race, sexual persuasion or not, ableism, or any form of exceptionalism served the hierarchical ambition of the British art history to keep things outside of itself. Here we are at the cusp of the 40th anniversary of the formation of the Black Art Group. Can I have the next slide, please? I'm interested in the way that the current frame of Black art history has been able to erase much more than it realizes, including the place of political Black art and the seminal role of British Asians. I want to flesh out this reworking into a phenotypical version of which has destabilized the legacy of many of the key drivers of the critical decade. You may ask, why? I will counter it with, do we need to add further existing erasure in a time when artistic agency in Janus style is watching the marketplace as well as ensuring a distinguished legacy? Why are we enforcing an uncritical or even downright selfish view of a political Black visual culture when it was critically embedded in the post-colonialism of what Ockway and Weser called discursive domains, circuits of artistic knowledge production and research modules? Now, if we were there, why are we at the moment, in a sense, leading those conduits of discourse especially at a time in what we could call the expediency of change and global challenges are needed? And of course, the progressive left, if we think about the voices and the work of Paul Gilroy, Stuart Hall, and Kobena Mercer, always leaned on visual culture and asked and worked with culture practitioners to make very important arguments in the politics of academia, and especially in the departments of culture studies and media studies. What I'm interested to understand is the distinctive nature of the art world that existed between 1979 and 1992. And this requires a nuanced view of its organizational methods, its historical trajectories, and the political agency that activated and animated the critical decade in question. Critical to this understanding is to examine matters of agency, consciousness, pedagogy, and rhetoric that are central to any public discourse about politics, not to mention education itself. With these opening thoughts, let me share one fact. This is not a new inquiry for me. I've attempted to examine this decade through excavating one singularity, or the singularity of one year, 1989, and what it offered. Can I have the next slide, please? As you can see in the slides, this was manifested in the form of a one-day conference, international conference, called 1989 This is Tomorrow, Decanonization and Decolonization, which was hosted at the Quarter Institute of Art on the 9th of November, 2019, and organized by the 1989 Collective, which is on the right-hand side of the screen. If you can have the next slide, please. And these are some of the speakers who were there, both internationally and from Britain. And once more, please, Paul. As a sort of, perhaps as a prescient gesture, I would also like to return to the making of the Panchayat's Arts Education Resource Unit, which itself began in 1988 and functioned independently between 1988 till 2015, when its contents were donated to the Tate Library, where it is held as part of its special collection. This early archiving and collecting practice enabled a history to be available to the present. But having talked about those two elements, it allows you to understand that I have a long history, both with this decade, but also to the place of collecting, place of research, as well as working through strategies to allow others and involve others with it. This also reminds me of TrAIN in many ways. And I want to return to TrAIN slightly tangentially here. Just prior to the setting up of TrAIN, 3 of the members who were key to setting up TrAIN set up a project, what would be called a landmark effort called Handsworth's Self-Portrait, which is situated in Grove Lane in Handsworth. It was a project commissioned by a local voluntary organization called AFFOR, AFFOR, which stood for All Faiths for One Race. And the whole project, Handsworth's Self-Portrait, was to counter the bad press that the inner city neighborhood was receiving. And of course, in the bad press was a stereotyping and blaming of his residents for his condition. The project was set out to show the diverse faces of his population. The results were shown in Birmingham and elsewhere. It seems key to remember that TrAIN, its editorial perspective, was essentially an activist space, much like Handsworth's Self-Portrait was. And we need to remember activist spaces are a means and not an end in themselves to reach a broad social majority that needs us. And I felt, returning back to this particular piece of work, which was formulated by a loose collective, which then became TrAIN, acted as an early form of photographic practice and social history, which was necessary at that time in Britain. And what's interesting, that it was produced in Birmingham. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, the collective included its founders, which were Birmingham-based photographer and associates, David Bishton, Brian Homer, and John Reardon, who during the autumn of 1979, prior to the 1981 riots that took place predominantly in Handsworth, Birmingham, provided passing pedestrians with the opportunity to make self-portraits against a white backdrop using an extension shutter release with the assistance of a photographer. I mentioned this work as a researcher and somebody who's been involved in the emergence of political Black artistic and curatorial voices since the early 1980s. The presence of those transnational perspectives in British art in the late 1970s and the 1980s was presented always through ideas, fragments, knowledge, memories, and notations. And what Bhikkhu Parekh, the Professor Bhikkhu Parekh, the political theorist Bhikkhu Parekh, suggested was a subcultural diversity. And this piece of work, to a large extent, exists to evaluate the place of subcultural diversity. And what I think Bhikkhu Parekh meant, and he states that what subcultural diversity does is to describe that they're not interested, or they do not want to be represented as an alternative culture, but they seek to pluralize the existing one. And I think this is important, an important step in how a piece of work was made, what its intentions were, how it involved a group of people who were local, who existed within a systemized, racialized, institutionalized hierarchy that created on a daily basis an interaction which was not at all civilized. Hans's self-portrait could be considered as one of the early responses to Margaret Thatcher's interview on Granada TV in 1978, in the run-up to the election, when she stated, or where she stated, and this is a quote from Margaret Thatcher, "There was a committee which looked at it and said that if we went on as we are, then by the end of the century, there would be 4 million people of the new Commonwealth or Pakistan here. Now that is an awful lot. And I think it means that people are really rather afraid that this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture." And this is the Prime Minister of Great Britain talking about his people. And needless to say, and needless to add here as well, on 4th of May, 1979, Margaret Thatcher accepted an invitation of the Queen Elizabeth II to form a government, which ended on 28th of November 1990 upon her resignation. What I'm interested in this piece of work, can you go back, Paul? Yeah. What I'm interested in this piece of work, Hans's self-portrait, is a strategy to place full-length photo paper outside in the street, which allowed the three photographers, Bishton, Homer, and Reardon, to take self-portraits, which were full-length portraits. They even talked about not scrimping on that paper deliberately, so that it would allow a full isolation of the people, give them the opportunity to represent themselves without the distraction of the built environment. And I think strategically, that white background, that little piece of cord in their hand, at that point, which they take their own image, self-imaging as such, is or could be ascribed as a footprint. One that starts to describe the use of artistic photography, which is therefore goes beyond the literal representation of a scene or a subject. That literal representation was already politicized. There was a large amount of heavy criticism coming from the local press and from politicians around the country. At the time of making this piece of work, Reardon, one of the three participants, cited the feminist photographer Angela Kelly's essay, "The Personal is Political," which was published in Camera Work in 1978, which partly examined the artist's ongoing series of the self-portraits, which were known as Women's Identity, which he created between 1975 and 1979. These portraits were also shown in the exhibition Three Perspectives on Photography in 1979, in an exhibition that Angela Kelly co-curated with John Tagg and Paul Hill at the Hayward Gallery at the South Bank, London. The influential series of portraits shot over a period of 5 years advocated the multiple ways feminism has impacted different women's photographic practices. This is Angela Kelly. Kelly was one of the forerunners of a more critical strand of postmodernism, which remained, in many ways, conscious of the idea of the self-portrait as both problematic and self-empowering. Kelly went on to produce a catalogue of the same name as the key essay, Feminism in Photography, which was actually published by the Arts Council of Great Britain, in which she outlined that her practice was sustaining a strong visual sensibility with a scholarly interest in issues of feminism, identity, and place. Thereafter, both the publication, her work, and the curating of the exhibition, Kelly remained a seminal figure at a time, especially at a time when artists were experimenting with strategies to determine what relevance a seemingly private practice has to a public audience. As a passing note, the co-curator of the exhibition, Three Perspectives on Photography, was John Tagg, who had also played a key role in the critical decade, bringing together the role of photography in the processes of modern social regulation. More generally, considering what concept of photographic representation entailed and asking the key question at the right time, what are its consequences? John Tagg's book, The Burden of Representation, Essays on Photographies and Histories, was published in 1988, tracing a previously unexamined history that included the meaning, status, and effects of photographs. 6 years later, in 1994, Kobena Mercer wrote Welcome to the Jungle, New Positions in Black Culture Studies. I think we have a slide of that. Can you see if the next slide is that? Nope, sorry, I missed out on that. So anyway, 6 years later, in 1994, Kobena Mercer wrote Welcome to the Jungle. And in the introduction, which was titled Black Britain and the Cultural Politics of Diaspora, he debates about the burden of representation. So in a strange way, 6 years later, he talks about the burden of representation as a restricted economy of minority representation in which one speaks for all. I point out this chronology in the need to examine how one term, the burden of representation, has two distinct intentions or interpretations by two key art historians. Tagg's pertinent observations serve to evaluate colonial histories, especially the power of authentication that exceeded the power of representation, while Mercer's trajectory was based on lived experience and the influence of a homogenized white institution towards a political Black person in its midst. When a Black person was in the midst, as Lubena Hamid said in 1987, that she felt that being an artist, being Black and a woman has its difficulties. These are, and she goes on, that teaching in art school is hardly ever possible, that our writing and criticism are rarely published, and that getting grant from ever decreasing resources is miraculous. How times have changed, some of you might think, but this wasn't very far away, in time. This history and artistic development only remains recorded in catalogs, in leaflets, in gallery handouts, some conference papers. And of course, critical debates were more often to be found in specific art and photographic journals, including Third Text, Polarize, Tenate, Bazaar, Artrage. A number of these publications can be found, as they can be found in the Panchayat collection at the Tate Library, but most of them are unavailable. They're not even in libraries of institutions, of universities, or in the public domain. The instance of even a catalog, such as the one for The Other Story, is now worth £300 on eBay. Talks about the fact that these publications do not circulate as easily as we think they do. The second problem about circulation of the material which was generated at the time of the critical decade and was the fact that a lot of the material was not printed, or they sort of were bound to the parameters of the political Black centers from which often these narratives emerged as counter discourses. So for instance, the three things which I'm going to mention now, two of them do not exist. There's no foundational space for us to return to even evaluate what happened there. So for instance, TrAIN itself disbanded in the early 90s, 93, I think, was the last occasion where they did something in the public. Bazaar, where Alan D'Souza was involved as a key writer, disbanded much earlier, I believe. And Urban Fox Press, which was Maud Salter and Lubena Hamid's co-founders, as an imprint, it disappeared. The only one that exists still is the third text, and Rashida Ryan, the founder of London and Asia. It's one of the few things that has had more than 10, 15 years longevity. In a strange way, how do we provide a lucid account of the processes and institutionalization of that restricted economy, as Mercer points out? David A. Bailey talked about trying to create an analysis outside of the sacred frame. And what he meant by the sacred frame was the canon. Rashida Ryan, in his writing, always referred to the mainstream as a citadel. Both of those terms, the sacred frame and the citadel, in a nuanced way, we're talking about a certain parameter within which the critical decade found itself, in a sense, barking towards its long absence in the mainstream culture. What I think happened at the critical decade was not only important for British art history, it's actually important for the political Black history of the country. Because in the absence of not being in the mainstream culture, it affected and restricted the political space, which in itself had other consequences. One of the consequences was that in the critical decade, commentators had to raise issues unquietly. What I mean by that is that Britain had always been strategically divided. Thatcher's presence at that moment reawakened passionate arguments on many sides of Britain's class divide. This was absolutely evident in the way that she was nicknamed the Iron Lady. And I think we have a slide of this. Oh, it's all right, leave it at that. That's a good slide to go on. In Paul Gilroy's seminal publication, There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, published in 1987, throughout the publication, he reconsiders the socio-political context that was manifest in the 1980s. But 3 years prior to the British Prime Minister's resignation in 1990, Gilroy, in a succinct way, describes the unfolding of this 11 years of Thatcherism as and I quote him here, the simple exclusionary way that it was not so very long ago. And what he means by that is the place of limits, which was absolutely there in the exclusionary way, of paternalism and authority. All of these were used, in a sense, as guiding objectives, which allowed, and I argue that, which allowed a pushback against the interests of high tourism in Britain. The exclusion, in a sense, was a necessity to organize, to educate, to build guiding objectives that informed a sense of independence in galleries. And Gilroy himself remarks on this, that there were echoes from that exclusion of an extraordinary creative factors and efforts which were explored by multiple parties and who responded to the mapping of these boundaries. So people who were surveyed started being the surveillance seekers. What was inscribed on the immigrant's body, on the immigrant's labor, and immigrant's culture and psyche consolidated, in a sense, that culture can exist with immigrant influence. As such, the advent of political Black culture in the 1980s was viewed as sudden, as violent, something negative or unwelcome. It was seen as an event that suddenly complicated the dialogues and the genealogy of race in British culture. Can I have the next slide, please? In the chronology of the late 1970s and the early 1980s, this series of events, this unwelcome series of events, this sudden violent, was in the advent of grassroots organizations moving through the political economy towards anti-racism, towards women's rights, and towards feminism, working towards nuclear disarmament, and of course, anti-imperialism. And when anti-imperialism was talked about in that time, it was about the Irish problem. This was perceived as a growing strength of the radical left. In sharp contrast, the radical left attributed British capitalism as a form of decline, and Britain's lack of dynamism compared to West Germany as an essential conservatism that interpenetrated its political sectors. So again, there was this dynamic dualism, left, right, radical, conservative. Ontologically, the critical decade enlarged, broadened limits of these perceptible vectors. In enlarging these vectors, we had what was seen to be a sort of a demand, a growing, a fallout, possibly even an usurping of values. What followed in the 1990s was a strange resting phase, a lull. And that which was following that lull is what I would describe as a kind of post-millennium rush in urban Britain to build an inclusive and a global friendly society that breaks again as within the unexpected results of Brexit. But I won't go there at this point. What I think is important in what was seen as this usurping moment was the need that was asserted and addressed in the critical decade, which was the challenge to establish racial pluralism in British culture. A pluralism which had remained intensively locked in its post-war tensions between supporters of multiracial labor force and those unwilling to give up the rampant ideology of an empire that had stretched across 5 continents. What the critical decade represents is a cartography of outmaneuvering the oppression and the oppressor. In the critical decade, many became seekers in non-Western philosophies, in diasporic ideals, even if in this moment, and even if deliberately in this moment, it remains lightly annotated in British art history. The critical decade is an unmarked organic formation of aspiring forces, an unfettered political Black culture at the forefront of British anti-racism, seeking to unite those with ancestries in Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia. Those seeking as well to unite those who migrated or were forced into exile. Through a diverse set of activists and groups that created a Black political identity and formed community-based responses to racial inequality. Therefore, political Black organizations were often perceived as socialist and revolutionary. It is in this demand for human rights, a centering of psychoanalytical awareness, it's in the ambience of internationalism that constituted political Black agency, an agency drawing on transnational efforts, which had already resulted in independence from Britain and in the formation of the new Commonwealth. As a movement, political Black culture included authors, performers, exhibition makers, event organizers, festival heads, artists, scholars, technicians, educationalists, and editors, publishers, who work closely with white interlocutors to achieve success in certain fields. Can I have the next slide, please? Actually, we can stay with this slide, sorry. But it wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always stable. In a conversation, I want to go to a conversation that happens at that time between the artist and publisher Rashida Ryan, who confronts the artist and curator Eddie Chambers, that he had a problem with what Chambers considered to be Black art. This conversation took place specifically to a group of Rashida Ryan talking about a group of artists of both Asian and African ancestry, which Chambers had curated for Black art plotting the course in 1988. Chambers, perplexed, answered that the premise of the exhibition, Plotting the Course, and I quote him here, exists, centers around the notion that there is a wider constituency of artists whose practice crisscrosses the ideology of Black art. And Chambers goes on, and this is the interesting part for me. He says, the artists you mentioned, and Rashida Ryan had mentioned, I think, 4 artists. The artists you mentioned are not necessarily the artists one would associate with a Black art movement, but there are specific works by them within which I would have no problems of classifying as Black art. When I read this and tried to do a close reading of this conversation and the virtues of this conversation, I realized that at this point in 1988, political Black art was dependent on systems and relations that it hosted. And what I mean by that that Black Art movement had emerged from a community development and had now already moved across hierarchies. The evidence of change, according to Gilroy, was, we can now go to that little text by Gilroy there, and I'll read out what's already on the slide, is that combative and fluid coalition of sufferers, which is the community I tried to talk about earlier on, was, let us say, set in motion by the British-born children and grandchildren, roughly between Enoch Powell's 1968 Rivers of Blood speech and the rioting of the mid-1980s, the Handsworth riots, substantially improved the political position of Black settlers. So that usurping, that coming forth, did bear results. And what was normative as such of political Black organizations, including galleries in Britain, as being perceived as revolutionary, socialist, and embedded in the fundamental schema, which is left of the center of British conservative reality, had at this point, in a sense, been exhausted to a point nearly being dysfunctional. The stark labor of challenging and advancing racial pluralism in Britain took its toll. And in London, where I was based, a number of the galleries just dismantled, fell apart. The Black Art Gallery, the Horizon Gallery, the People's Gallery in Camden, the 198 in Brixton, Battersea Arts Centre, which all had flourishing galleries. Frustrated now by transactional realities, the earlier roots or establishing of roots and processes that did and could have yielded greater results now, in a sense, ended. And the political Black art scene, in a sense, became professional. And what I mean again by that is that there were so many things going on, some of it groundbreaking, some of it trialsome, related to political Black discourse, that it changed very suddenly to become Black and Asian British artists and arts, as it is known now. It still plays a key role in increasing contemporary meaning of social and racial equity. But the taxonomy of the decade is modalities in publishing, the exhibitions, the relevances of places and spaces were different. At that point, archiving was different, documenting was addressed, creating terms that fundamentally needed reviewing, especially the conceptual, political, and historical complexity of being in Britain was present. What I'm trying to get at is that the route the critical decade took in the 1980s and early 1990s had remained within a non-exclusionary, often collective form. Not necessarily curated, but everything was committed. Things were addressed. We had come to a point to understand oppression from different perspectives, each presenting different solutions. Often speaking from individual histories. This allowed the development of a vocabulary to reach a broader social majority. In much the same way, the critical decade was a place of power. it knew and it worked with the administration, for instance, of minority art, which is how it was at that point. Black British culture was considered minority art. The administration of minority art as a policy that often removed and dispersed rather than making visible a political Black history. It counteracted much of what was coming towards it. And in that, it was able to write and address much more succinctly. I remain interested in these moments and what was said and increasingly written that became normative within that moment. For instance, I turn again to the artist curator Rashida Ryan. And can we have the next slide, please? The curating of the other story at the Hayward Gallery in 1989 was an incredibly intense period when the pressure revealed the difficulties often faced by those who took upon themselves to be figures of authority. And Rashid was a challenged and challenging figure at that point and remained so ever since, and also prior to that, of course. The development, in a sense, the professionalization of Black arts, to a certain extent, created a place of those in authority, possibly even we can say curatorial authority. In Britain, where authority is often defined by class or culture or wealth or gender and their articulations. I believe what happened at the point of the other story was an intergenerational space that had started to develop in the 1990s that affected the norms of political Black. The emergence of Black curating, and thus what had been embraced as protest culture, became differently aligned. I'll try and depack that a bit more here. The other story, which was subtitle was Asian, African, and Caribbean Artists in Post-War Britain, not political Black artists in Britain, was an exhibition with a catalogue which included works by 24 artists, and which remains a seminal event. In the exhibition catalogue, the Hayward Gallery director, the then Hayward Gallery director, Joanna Drew, wrote, and this is a quote, "Making an exhibition on the basis of racial origin is not something that comes easily to the art world. We have to take a kind of closer reading of this sentence, which is a great provocation. And we had to ask which art world, or more precisely, whose art world are we talking about? As if the other story was not of the art world, shouldn't have been in Britain. And to a certain extent, it was complicated by a further stream that went against the other story at the same time. And I have to sort of like kind of take a sideway entry to explain what this other stream was. More recently, the author Bernardine Evaristo was complimented not by a cartoon by Kipper Williams for Private Eye, in which a white man points to a radio as his wife gazes from a doorway, and he says, "Quick, Bernardina Evaristo isn't on." Quick, Bernardine Evaristo isn't on. On her Instagram account, the author writes, and this is a quote from her, "If people object Is it because I'm a Black woman claiming a little space? And are we supposed to be marginal, invisible, silent, question mark? We're used to those who have always dominated the airways, that we don't even notice their dominance, as if it's their right to be heard, but not ours, end of quote. Such methods of trolling Black visibility by forces colluding for the dominant group of homogenized white presence, white British presence, on the airwaves or everywhere else, creates the fear of the ghettoizing context. One that Orion explains as one of the reasons in the 1980s, late 1980s, as to why certain artists of color did not want to participate in the Other Story exhibition. But they believed their work would be confined to locate artists and their elliptical histories to the tensions of anti-racism and anti-imperialism work, and the use of the Black that furthers decolonial values from within a ghettoized chorale. So even then as now, the idea of being visible is, in a strange way, within the British art and coexisting in British art, a difficult one. In the new millennium, we have been, in a sense, determined to be part in the community of citizens. Yet that determination only comes, the Black British experience emerges vis-a-vis the wrath and anger following the death of George Floyd. Even Waldemar Januszek forgives himself with a subheading in the Times, and I'll quote him here, "I was a skeptic, but diversity in art has been wondrous, and maybe it's salvation." Now, I want to just also bring in a couple of other points before I start going towards a conclusion. I'm just trying to be aware of the time. The general reading of the critical decade is that it indicates the advent of lens-based practice, digital media, and the internet, adding a plurality of media at artists' disposal. In reality, this is an allusion to plurality of media. For political Black artists who had access, and it was to community darkroom, color Xerox facilities, and floppy disks, creating clumsy animation using early versions of editing. Instead, I want to argue here that one of the key developments in the 1980s and 1990s is the place of authority figures, and authorities, currently celebrated as influencers. Those who were able and enabled to define who is a Black artist and what is a work of Black art. I return back to this exchange between Chambers and Orion, for it suggests the advent of a strong, intelligent, courageous, emotional leadership with combative resources emerging from their field, stepping center stage in galleries, education, curricula, historicizing, and visibly willing to agree or disagree, suggest or persuade. In many ways, the start of curation, the start of being central to the field, was one which included several academics and scholars from universities and research centers who routinely opened exhibitions, gave lectures, or wrote texts from the culture studies realm in the media arts of the 1980s and early 90s. They became several of the valuable voices from the community, which included authors, lawyers, directors, publishers, educators, and professors. Who all offered an understanding of what was happening, writing history of the contemporary times from their instant reflection became part of the spoken norm. Kobena Mercer calls this both a critical mass and a Black representation, a new class of cultural animators who used whatever materials came to hand. These professionals, these professors brought to political black art a number of things, including forms of recording, followed by transcriptions. An essential gathering for efficient researchers, this transcriptions and contact provided a thread which needs emphasizing here. The technology of the period, which was both visual and audio recordings and the storage of this material, assisted in framing the decade as political or identity politics rather than political black art. It also created a crossover to an academic field, which was already examining the relationality to anti-racism, anti-ableism, feminism, identity politics, post-independence struggles. And in a strange way, we came back to an understanding which Saadia Hartman calls an epistemic failure. Simply put, it means we had actually failed in one and more ways of acquiring and justifying our knowledge of something. And that something, to a large extent, is the critical decade. The critical decade was not only full of visual fine arts. It had multiple curiosities. It was a colossal collective effort by artists, but as well as craftspeople with a global accent. Can we have the next slide, please? The crafts which were present in Britain in that period have more or less disappeared now. This was diasporic knowledge that helped to reflect the challenges of life in Britain through a new fertile approach. From textiles, fashion, streetwise to stagecraft, pottery, lost wax processes. These went beyond the circumscribed diversity of the critical decade review of art that currently exists. The critical decade brought to the forefront problematic histories, sure. It confronted the unjust, sure. But it was always in the constant whiplash of state threats and local authorities' lack of care. The artists and the craftspeople brought to British culture a constellation of systems that were particularly groundbreaking, different forms of diversification. They provided new insights into the field of poetry, costume design, and they brought from traditional culture a different type of street culture, a performative, which was both carnival and theatre, fashion, which was both textile and critical. They even brought in sound systems. These need to be carefully revisited, besides the canon of fine art. And a large amount of organizations, and I'll list them here, and I'm not going to, can you have the next slide? From Africa Center, Janako Arts, the Drum Center, Third World Center, even Iliad Drama and Tape Center, played crucial roles in linking these formations of greater arts to the greater metropolitan education and its pleasure. London, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, Cardiff, and Glasgow were buzzing with workshops, performances, and venues engaged with a new Commonwealth diversity. These remain unrecognized within our current understanding of the critical decade. Key figures who were important instigators of in a sense, broader understanding of what arts and crafts meant included people like Kwesi Owusu, Aki Nawaz, Levi Tafari, Suwendi, Horace Ove, Maxine Walker, Priti Manuel. The list can go on and on. I'm barely scratching it here. They remain underrepresented in our study. And what I would consider is an acceleration of 40 years of neoliberal knowledge production that has followed. This was contact, this was threads, there was an emphasis. This was sophisticated level of engagement with traditional knowledge, skills, and applications that invoked a presence from the diaspora in the 1980s. The art historian Kobena Mercer suggests that the Black Art Group, an all Midlands-based school graduates group in the 1981, were wrestling with the question, whose language do we speak? Mercer suggests they found traction, as it describes, in the newfound expression by reworking the legacy of what had come before. That before, that he suggests, requires to be asked, who is the witness? Who can claim that agency? Processes of writing history, particularly when involved untold, unarchived, or invisibilized narratives, depend primarily on acts of witnessing. Acts aiming to render oneself and one's story visible. And this visibility still remains highly occluded. I want to conclude now. Given my lived experience in history since the 1980s, both as an individual brown man and as a member of the artistic community defined by political Black, I have been examining the relationality to anti-racism, anti-ableism, feminism, identity politics, diasporic knowledge. With such a premise and conclusion, I want to leave you with two observations that demand further scrutiny. The first point pertains to what we have witnessed in the last decade in reference to the import of Black. My primary question is, how did the Black Lives Matter movement move the remnants of political Black and provincialize it as a historical artifact, transposing its central debates about civil rights in a transnational society to the periphery? Let me expand on this a tiny bit. We need to raise some direct questions in terms of social discourse in times of accentuated and accelerated media. Did the idea about institutional and policy change coming in the culture sector from the American experience force commitments, or do these already need addressing, as it seems like a window of opportunity rather than a long-term investment? It was a bit clumsy. Let me just try and get back to this. How do we, to a certain extent, have come to agree to the departure of our own history? How have we come to agree to such a move? That what had happened in the last only 40 years ago doesn't, in a sense, exist. The work, the labor, the intensity has just been removed from the record. The second thing is, and this is the probing question, I invite you to look at Documenta 11 and the current Sharjah Biennale 15, which embodies one of the largest contingency of political Black artist constellations. How did such an illustrious team of Okwi's collaborators, who had joined him in challenging the notion of centralized intellectual and artistic authority, especially in terms of Eurocentric avant-garde, link Sharjah to transnational intellectuals and artist discourses? So the second point is, there's a disjuncture between the history of the critical decade and the present day appropriation of the Black art. This calls for a closer look at the dynamics of the curatorial discourse and the burgeoning relationship between, in this case, two seemingly disparate communities in different stages of their development. One part of the Emirates, with much that remains guided by ideas and histories that retain Islamic stricture, and another a diasporic collection of second-generation artists, either born in Britain or subjects who grew up in the Commonwealth or ascended from the former British Empire. Beyond the fact they have very different histories, there are several factors which are interesting, namely the dovetailing of the post-global curation or even post-lockdown assemblies, which have relied on a select group of British artists from Britain, Black artists from Britain, which have relied on a select group of Black artists from Britain. Eddie Chambers has called this the fetishization of the Black art movement. Keith Piper has asked for it to be called the scrutinization of the Black art movement. But yet, what remains and makes me wonder, is there some urgency in political Black art which has been dimmed in the passage of British time, where many people are hanging the world's colonial onto? Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Shaheen, for that incredible lecture. There was so much in there that we could delve into, so many questions that emerged, but some really, really important insights and a really close reading of the construction of that decade, which is now being, as you say, now being canonized in various ways, which is a good thing. But some of the difficult questions that emerged, that I think some of the questions you've raised, I think, this is an opportunity to really kind of go back into that close reading and to kind of come out with an alternative understandings of that so-called critical decade. What I think we're going to do now is to have a very short 5-minute comfort break, and then so if we could just be 5 minutes literally, and then we can come back and then open up to some questions for Shaheen for that incredible lecture. So while we do that, we're going to have a little bit of music that Shaheen has selected. Tanita Tikaram, Twist in My Sobriety, which we played at the beginning. So just for 5 minutes now, you can either listen to the music, think about some of the questions that you want to ask, and then we'll come back at about 20 past. Okay, 20 past 7. Thank you.
Now your conscience is clear. In the morning when I wipe my brow, wipe the miles away. I like to think I can be so willed and never do what you say. I'll never hear you and never do what you say. Look, my eyes are just holograms. Look, your love has drawn red from my hands. From my hands, you know you'll never be more than twist in my sobriety. More than twist in my sobriety. We just put a little empty pie for the fun the people had at night. Late at night, don't need hostility. Timid smile and pause too free. I don't care about their different thoughts. Different thoughts are good for me. Up in arms and chasing home. All good children took their toll. Look, my eyes are just holograms. Look, your love has drawn red from my hands. From my hands, you know you'll never be more than twist in my sobriety. More than twist in my sobriety. soft and boogie. You pick out till you've seen the light. Pick out till you've seen the light. Look, my eyes are just holograms. Look, your love has drawn red from my hands. From my hands, you know you'll never be more than twist in my sobriety. More than twist in my sobriety.
What do you think of this guy? Terrible, isn't he? Next!
Thank you. Thank you. We'll be in touch. Next.
Good luck.
Next.
Do well.
There's a good tradition of love and hate. Staying by the fireside. There's a good tradition of love and hate. Staying by the fireside. Now the rain may fall. Your father's calling you. You still feel safe inside. And your mom's too proud. Your brother's ignoring you. You still feel safe inside. Was it solo? Was it yesterday? Was it true for you? 'Cause while all the rest have taken time, it's taking me alive for you. And corners laced with memories. Tell you how it used to be. Your mother smiles, children play, and all the bad things happen miles away, and it's gone for you.
Okay. I think this is Wham Bam, Shaheen. I'm not sure this is the right one. Can turn this into a music session here. Okay, wonderful. Great. So if you would like to, at this point, I think you can turn on your cameras so we can see who's in the room. But if you don't mind, keeping muted until you ask a question. If you want to ask a question, can you please, I can see some very familiar faces. Hello, everyone. So please feel free to use the hand function to ask a question. Hopefully I'll see it. If I don't see it, then you can unmute yourself and then ask, say that you want to come in. Because what we want to do now is have more of a conversation, an interactive conversation, because there are many people I know in the room who were indeed part of the critical decade or have worked around that field, and many people that are interested in it. Just to kind of warm up as people are gathering themselves for the questions. I mean, Shaheen, you raised many, many different questions and I think provocations as well, particularly your final two provocations about Black Lives Matter, which you if I read you correctly, you kind of implied the Black Lives Matter movement in some ways provincialized the critical decade. And you sort of say, how do we get to a stage where parts of our own history has has been kind of neglected in a way. And I think that also relates to the earlier period, which you did mention briefly, when you were talking about the debate between Eddie Chambers and Rashid Alain, when Chambers kind of talked about the Black Art movement, which of course was a very important movement that came from the United States, okay, in which many young Black artists were then relating to in Britain. But it was essentially the notion of a Black Art movement was an American import. So again, at these two times, it feels as though there's a kind of, a very important dialogue with African-American traditions, but which can in some ways, arguably, as I think you've hinted at with Black Lives Matter, it can lead to the marginalization of a Black British history. Yeah. And just lastly, the second provocation, which I think is really interesting, which I hadn't thought of really, which was in the ways in which, in a sense, because you talk about the transnational elements of Black British or the critical decade in political Black art, which I think is really important, something that I know I've been working on for a long time. People like Deborah Cherry, who I believe is in the conversation today, has also been writing about and talking about the very transnational components of it. In fact, TrAIN itself, I think, was very much a product of that. But it's what you brought up, which I think is really fascinating, Shaheen, is that there's a kind of more recent appropriation or fetishization by various transnational elements. You mentioned Sharjah Biennial, for example, where there's a very large proportion of Black British artists in that show. I haven't seen the show yet, but I've heard from many people that have seen it and are there. But you kind of imply that there's something to be looked at and unpicked there. So maybe I'll just stop there and just say, just to open up before we kind of get people to come in and give questions, just to sort of respond a little bit and maybe unpack a little bit those two provocations around the provincialization of our that history by the Black Lives Matter movement or its reception, and also the ways in which it's become fetishized in international discourses and curatorial projects.
I think that provocation actually came from Bonnie Greer in a talk that she undertook at the British Museum about a year and a half ago, in which she suggested outright that there is an Americanization, a globalization, which is now Americanization of fashion, of music, of style, of all cultural forms, basically. We eat American pizza, not Italian pizza necessarily. So it kind of, in a sense, we have to think about its place in protest culture, in history, and how it, in a sense, and this is, again, Narendra Pachkede, who is a very key thinker, has talked about the homogenization of protest culture through Black Lives Matter. And I think it's a kind of burgeoning relationship. Different stages of its development are taking place in different parts of the world, as well as in different parts of culture formations. I just think we need to be guarded. There are fantastic historians and fantastic ideas coming out of North America. Some of the writings and the conferences are brilliant, breathtaking. But we need to reinsert our local frameworks, our ascendancy into the discourse. Otherwise, we're going to be pigeonholed by things which are happening in the Midwest rather than in the Midlands. And it kind of complicates our intentions. It relies on somebody else's biography. its formal implications in the way that we view art or artworks is not really based on the personality that we have of it. It's a personality and a methodology and a motivation that comes from completely somewhere else. It might be speaking the same language, but it's not the same nuanced. So I'm just asking for us to think about the staging mechanisms which are at play at the moment, the socio-political arrangements which could make us into a topic, but doesn't necessarily mean it generates anything deeper than that for us to be actively listening to it all the time.
Sure. No, thank you for that, Shaheen. I agree with much of that. Just one more quick question from me, and then please, I'll open this up to the community to come in, because I'm sure there's, as I said, many questions. I was quite struck as well. I mean, there's many things that that I could talk about, but one is about your emphasis or the way that you characterized lens-based media as being an important part of the critical decade, and I can imagine that probably came in quite a lot in the 90s. You extended the way that you periodize it is from, goes into the 90s, of course.
Sure.
But it's interesting because in many of the retellings of the critical decade, and in the recent sort of exhibitions, canonization, often focuses, of course, on the Black art movement in the early 80s and some of the works that where photography was not necessarily prominent in some of those exhibitions, although of course there were photographic reproductions as part of many of the works, photocopies, etc. But I was quite struck by this, the importance of photographic image, and of course 10/8 was a photographic journal, which was, and from which the whole notion of critical decade was actually coined by 10/8, by that great special edition, which I'm very pleased to say that I have, and I don't have to pay, I don't know how many hundreds of pounds on the internet to get it. But yeah, could you just maybe elaborate on that a bit, because perhaps we're missing a trick a little bit in the way that we are kind of celebrating it. And because in some respects I think a lot of lens-based media, both film and particularly experimental film, as well as photography, has been kind of left out of the narrative somewhat. I wonder if you could maybe just speak to that a little bit.
I felt stifled by the fact that the critical decade, which is a fantastic way to bring the notion of criticality, whose criticality, which criticality, and the forms of expression which are in it, stifled by the fact that it was not about a greater cultural formation and a greater political commitment, but one which was attended to by the way that discussion between David A. Bailey and Stuart Hall had allowed it to become only addressing, because it was a photo-based journal as such, or a lens-based journal, that had supplemented that conversation, or had allowed that conversation to be printed and allowed it to be. Then that whole idea of the critical decade as a last, also the last of the 10/8 publications, is interesting because it in a sense brings out Mark Seeley and its relationship to autograph, because what happens is that Mark Seeley is involved in the critical decade at that time with 10/8, and after they basically lose money and cannot carry on, there is a reformation of the values of 10/8 in a photographic festival outside of England. So there's an emphasis and determination for it to be carried on within the lens-based arena. I want to claim back us to refocus on the work that was actually going on at that time, which is then bookmarked by this. Both what I'm trying to do is to use the publication of TrAIN as an important publication, but also the term of the time of the abysmal space, which was Thatcherism, which was highly, highly volatile, highly, highly violent to all migrant communities in Britain. It was a threat on every street. It was a threat on every household. And we need to narrate and we need to find meaning to what happened to our personal as well as our community motivation. What did it stir and how did it, in a sense, chart all these different elements which came out? Because we were up against the wall. I mean, you know, and then we, in a sense, remained there. We need to review not only that time, but the trauma of that period, which unfolded and systematically thrashed us. And it was a thrashing. You know, there's no two ways to describe it. It impacted every person of color in this country. Systematically, we were reclassed as a second citizen.
Okay, thank you, Shaheen. So at this point, I'd really like to open it up to the community. Don't be, even though I've been berating you to turn your cameras off, you can now turn your cameras on so we can see who's in the room and have more of a meeting. So please feel free to turn your cameras on, and if you want to ask a question, I will try and see if I can't see everyone, but I can kind of circulate, and if not, just please you know, unmute yourself and say what your question is. And I know that many of you, I can see Maria I think put her hand up. Please, Maria, unmute yourself and fire away. Are you muted?
Hi, I didn't have any questions. I just—
Oh, you didn't? I thought I saw you move your hand. Okay.
Since someone I am on, thank you so much for a really important lecture. I think all the questions that you've been asking is lurking underneath the skin, and it's been there, and it is still there. And I think many geographical kind of ignorance really that we've had in the art world hopefully will come out. We'll be able to speak about it. But yes, so I will have my questions, but I'm not going to take over right at the moment. So I'm just going to leave it until I can really think of I can articulate my question properly, basically. So yeah, but thank you for that talk. I'm thinking about your questions.
Thank you, Maria.
Any other takers? Michael?
Yeah,
Also, just to say, just when you introduce yourself, just say who you are. Just
okay. I'm sorry. I'm Michael Asbury. I'm Paul's colleague at TrAIN, and I'm a reader at Chelsea College of Art in the history of arts and art and theory, basically. Yeah, thank you very much for your lecture, and it was fascinating, and it's very nice to see so many kind of familiar either faces or names here as well, including some people that I haven't seen for a very long time. So that's a very nice reunion. I was intrigued by the kind of, I mean, you just mentioned autograph just now, but I was curious about the kind of lack of mention of the kind of very crucial institutions that kind of were pioneering in showing a lot of this work, either in the 80s or early 90s. And I mentioned two examples, but there are far many more. For example, the Blue Coat in Liverpool, or Iniva, which kind of was fundamental until it kind of was sabotaged by funding cuts, etc. So I'm just wondering how the institutions around Britain, kind of beyond the kind of centralized London scene, figure in your kind of analysis of this period and this group of artists and artivists and so on.
Thank you very much. I deliberately didn't mention the larger, very large organizations that kind of were given birth to on the ashes of the ones which were basically demolished. But the mere fact that they had the power to articulate, they had the Arts Council reception policy as part of their toolkit. So there are this kind of meta-narratives that already exist about those organizations, and they've been very alert to the fact that their legacies are already written. For instance, the last British Arts Network was more or less in the Blue Code, about the Blue Code, and about the director of the Blue Code. So it doesn't need to be talked about anymore. What needs to be talked about, certainly, is what has been left out. And I was trying to respond to that as much as possible. And there was so many different elements which had been left out, including the crafts, and also those people like Nina Edge and myself who were working with making the crafts into a sustainable method and tool to organize our thoughts and our ambitions for the visual arts. So I was trying to make fundamental comments to justify their presence and the presence of that which has remained unacknowledged in the quest for a fine art, black art, which again works within the hierarchies of Western canon and not necessarily part of the diaspora's understanding of what the avant-garde is. So I was, in a sense, maybe contextualizing it slightly different and trying to historicize something which remains dissented still.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yeah. I see that Nina Edge has got her hand raised. Nina, do you want to come in? I think Alia, did you have one as well?
Yeah.
So after Nina.
When in listening to Shaheen now, it just struck me that there's been an enormous disinterest on behalf of the really big British institutions in that critical decade, and also what followed it, because we didn't all just shut up and sit down. People carried on making really interesting, very pertinent work in all of the time between then and now. But the Transforming the Crown exhibition that Maura Bird curated of over 50 political black British artists in Studio Museum Harlem and Bronx Museum of the Arts was a moment where I met more of my colleagues in this field in New York than I'd ever managed to meet in Britain. We convened there, and the interest, the curatorial interest and the publishing interest was there. And it strikes me now as very odd, because we do have our counterparts in European countries. We don't share language. That's an issue. So there's kind of shaking, collapsing idea of Europe. It was in one piece when all that happened, and yet we didn't really, or in my experience, did not really connect with German or Belgian or Dutch or French artists doing the same thing. In fact, outside of Carnival, I don't know even if they did. So I wanted to ask a question about that interest being in America and us having that connection through language, and maybe that's a place where we reassert a presence. What do you think, Shaheen?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something very interesting about Transforming the Crown was in its very title, the possibility of taking a symbolic form and possibly have the ability and the skills to change it, to challenge it. And I think it spoke about Maura's interest in our interest in what was it to be an artist in the 1980s, because being an artist has changed so much in the recent period, that it's really good to try and understand what just came before, and how do we understand what came before, and what supplements from what came before to what is now. Is it a co-creative force? Does it allow the art world to think about critical differences and specific differences over a period of time? And how does that affect the process of making, the aesthetics? At one time, you couldn't get away from conversations about installation art. And at in this moment, nobody's having any conversation about installation art. And to that extent, it kind of makes it easier sometimes to invoke in this particular case into this talk, and to gesture towards that which is very quickly disappearing, very quickly erased. And in that erasure, we're losing a lot of ideas, a lot of accesses which were drawn together, on which so much revolved on. And you know, it was not only the politics, it was livelihoods, it was ideas, it was materials, it was a reality which has remained non-acknowledged, of what was discovered and what was found and what was supplemented and what was made possible. It was the political black art movement was a structure, a method, and a front line all rolled into one.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? I mean, you felt like you were somewhere where you're not supposed to be. You know.
Yeah.
Within yourself as well as from society, like, what the hell are you doing there? What is this? And that was interesting. I mean, we both found ourselves working with materials in the community because the community loved enjoying, they were complicit in making political black art possible, because the workshops which I was involved in were always so thrilling, both for myself as well as the education establishment or the community space that was hosting it. And it wasn't a financial arrangement. It was something else.
Okay. Is that okay, Nina?
Thank you.
Great. Alia, I think you might have had your hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
Have
I foisted it on you?
Well, thanks,
you were-
Shaheen, that was great. I was sort of interested in this notion that this image of being up against the wall and the trauma of that moment, and how for some people or for some communities the visibility that is available now has somehow soothed that trauma, whereas for others it has not been soothed. I don't know whether they're the right terms, but they're probably totally incorrect terms, but it's just this notion of that moment of total violence, at being at a loss, having nothing to withhold you or outstain you, but then actually later, and you term it the professionalization, and I'm sort of thinking that by professionalization you're meaning, or are you meaning that then that criticality is somehow lost?
Yeah.
And then, but then this, for me, I find it quite sad in that, you know, there was a political Black art movement that was encompassing, and for as much as those moments were terrible, this moment is also equally terrible. We have a young woman who was trafficked, Shamima Begum, whose citizenship has been taken away from her. There are so many people, so many communities, so many families whose citizenship are being taken away from us now, in this moment that we speak of.
Yeah.
Yet we're not understanding this moment as equally traumatic, because maybe those ball coasts have changed in that it's not specifically about the color of one's skin, but it's also about the religious background that you come from. And I sort of feel sad because there seems to be, and I think maybe that's what you might mean also by that provincialization, because that provincialization has allowed certain simplifications of the notion of communities of Black, communities of others, Black and Asian people, to be subsumed within a vernacular that then becomes much more easily accessible. And then we have exhibitions that only focus primarily on one community over another, and then the answer then is to speak from that community. And for me, I find that really sad.
Yeah.
And I was thinking actually that when you were talking that is, well, is the Black art scene critical, or is it actually radical? Is there a radicalness there? I mean, the radicalness seems to me in the difficulty that we reach each other. And once we let go of the difficulty of reaching each other, then that ceases to become radical.
Absolutely. I think there was a great desire to access one another in the 80s. There was a great curiosity. You know, we all came from different continents, not even different countries, and landed here, different languages and different histories, even different types of sunshine. And that desire was so pertinent to our existence in this country. It was the rescue remedy, in a sense. And somehow that desire we've been given or fobbed off with another desire, which is access as artists. We've been asked to create access not to each other, not to network, not to be together, not to gather anymore. We've been asked to go to these professionals, which are curators, collectors, and commissioners. In my recent conversation with Mina, it became obvious that this is how the Arts Council sees oneself, or should see oneself, in implementing our relationship to curation, collection, and commission. And I think that is an instrument of control. It is deliberately bottlenecking, because all three of those spaces that we are meant to go towards are already fulfilled and burgeoning point where they can't commit themselves any further, in Britain anyway. So we end up sort of waiting in a very long line, tinkering away rather than committing ourselves to anything more, until one of those three spaces, curation, collection, or commission, comes towards you and offers you something. And those triple C's, to a certain extent, have become the project for many artists. They remain to a certain extent decommissioned, decurated, and in a strange way, we become pioneers in trying to find access. We've forgotten about the process of making, and now we're asked to have conversations and staging. So this is a very different form of how both, in a sense, ageism works, as well as in terms of what remains of what we thought was faithful to our world, is how we remain disqualified by being placed in this way. I mean, women artists have also come to it knowingly that this is where they are, waiting to be commissioned, to be curated, and to be collected. This is the potential of difference, as Arndt would call it, that exists now.
Thank you for that, Shaheen. Just to add to those points that Alia made and you made, one of the things that I noted that you talked about the easy elision of professors and professionals, which I think, given that there are quite a few professors on this call I can see right now, including myself, are we part of the problem? Which I think is an interesting question. Are we actually now? And many, of course, of people from that time have actually become professors and professionals in the art world. So I don't know. I'll leave that there. Okay, so Narendra, did you have a question? I think this may be one. I think after this, one more. I think because we're now got 5 minutes left. So if you could make it a fairly brief question, Narendra, thank you.
Yeah, very brief. Lovely. I'm from the colonial outpost called Canada. And it is important in a way to listen to the conversation. And what I personally feel is the value that Shaheen offered is trying to answer the question why it is important to historicize critical decade, which is the imperative. Of course, the second part of that, the corollary to that question would be, how should it be historicized? Now, that will bring in the idea of methods and all its politics around method and methodology, which could be a fascinating conversation also. What I just wanted to zoom out a bit to understand, because the role of class got completely eliminated in much of this conversation. For instance, Stuart Hall and Shivananda had the obvious clash in terms of the idea on the word class itself. Similarly, 80s saw the French theory invading American campuses and creating, we know what it has led to, okay? So-called Black Lives Movement has been exported into all parts of the world like an American product. And I've been very sensitive about it when I say that, because we have to understand these discourses as products, not necessarily in a very discursive practice of politics itself. And there is a political economy behind it. And that's the point which we somehow miss in this entire conversation. And that which brings me to the idea of the underlining of the notion of lens-based work. 80s, of course, with the 70s, the video came out. Video became a very quick thing. And the dissensions were obviously like Hansworth's song, Salman Rushdie kind of hitting back in his very critical piece in Guardian to John's work, for instance. But the bigger picture was two key things that I will try to put across. Much of all these conversation, even today, we are trying to pose it from a Western understanding of history, which is framed in a Cold War understanding of the world. The history of 20th century is a history of third world revolutions, not just the Cold War. And that is a very fundamental thing which allows for the various solidarity to come together and for an emergence of a particular reality within UK, for instance, post 65, to be very precise. Same thing happens in US. Largely similar things happen in Canada, and of course, in those other parts of the Commonwealth with the movement of people. That's the moment. But the fundamental thing, like the larger orders which were actually being discussed and talked was like the what was it called, the whole movement for the new information and communication world order, which was defining the very deployment of technology, call it cameras, call it cinema, the making of the cinema, etc. The whole emergence of the third cinema movement, etc. And the Western understanding and resistance. The McBride report, I think that's the report, and it completely shut down. US took away the money. Why I'm mentioning these primarily because these are the broader political, economical imperatives that were framing what Shaheen was trying to suggest. This is where we need to, this is why we need to historicize. And we see if we don't do it, we will keep getting multiple Sharjahs, maybe another 4 rounds of Sharjahs, maybe multiplied by 10, which will completely dilute the very idea of Black itself and the very Black consciousness itself. So it then becomes, what Sharjah is doing is creating a Black product, and which is a problem. And I think that's where this conversation becomes a far more potent and urgent, I would say. Thanks.
Thank you, Narendra. Some very pertinent points there. Shaheen, do you want to respond to that?
No, I think Narendra said an abundant lot. You know, one of the things that Okwi did when he talked to some of the artists in Sharjah, he used the keyword circularity for the artists to think about in proposing the works and the commissions which they were eager to work through. And I think it's a great word, and the circularity also is a great word for what I think we were trying to talk about today, which is it's a template where not how only we see ourselves, but also how others see us and our history. And in that circularity, to some extent, in a sense, the grandeur of ordinary lives and ordinary thinking disappears, and you get something that rises up and be heard, and it's not necessarily what should be heard, because sometimes in ordinary lives and ordinary thinking, there's a great amount which has been understood and revolves around. But what I'm trying to get to is that we are at a point, in a very strange and interesting point for where we have reached in Britain, and how it chooses to use political Black art history, and then makes up a historical perspective, which is mirror that they want to reflect things through. And it's not the one which is, and the Tate is implicit in many ways in creating a narrative, which is a version and a performative space through which it creates blackness. It's seasoned, it's scripted, it's not interventionist, nor is it based on a context which was influenced by the things I was trying to talk about, which was the place of anti-racism, the place of building communities, the care which was there in terms of book launches, publishers like John LaRose, the consent that was given from the community to the artists and the writers and the authors and the publishers was fantastic. It was a place of abundance, which I think is missing at the moment.
Fantastic. I think I'm going. Thank you, Shaheen, and thank you everyone for joining the meeting today. Before I say thank you to Shaheen again, I wanted to just say there's Eddie Chambers, was one of the key members of that period, in which Shaheen also mentioned, is giving a lecture at in Camberwell, Peckham Road Lecture Hall, on Wednesday, the 1st of March at 12 o'clock. So, and I think that will also be online. That's organised by Raksha Patel from the painting course at Camberwell. So that promises to be a really interesting kind of rejoinder to what's a lot of what Shaheen was talking about. And of course, the 40th anniversary of the Black Art Movement is being kind of restaged and celebrated at Wolverhampton Art Gallery. I can't remember what the date was, Shaheen. I think it's in March.
29th of April.
29th of April. 29th of April. Shaheen and I, as you mentioned, are part of a research network around looking at visual arts organisations and Black arts in the Midlands, and we will be doing an event based on that conference, which will be a bit later. And there's also be a publication and other events that we'll do here at UAL and with TrAIN as well. So look out for that.